Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Dev Diary, where today we embark on a new voyage. Now recently on the channel I played an action shooter based version of RAFT, which is something I've wanted to do myself for a while now. I've also been quite keen on the concept behind the yet to be released Void Train, a game similar in concept to RAFT. So I figured why not merge those two ideas into a singular new mashup and see where things go from there. That's right, we're taking elements from both RAFT and Void Train and using them to create our own amalgamation. The main gameplay loop will be to traverse, loot, upgrade, and defend the base from oncoming dangers. Which sounds promising, but as always, the basics come first. And given I haven't worked on anything like this in a while, it'll be a good refresher. So let's not waste any more time and get to the coding. Now first up was the placement of our raft. In a left click check, the mouse's position would be translated into grid data, which would then be used to update the tile layer. A cooldown was also added to make placements less click heavy. And thankfully we're starting off with a success. The player could place raft tiles down as expected, and so we could move on. Though we will be back later to refine this. Up next was the addition of loot, which for now would be represented as little triangles. These triangles would be spawned at the top of the level every couple of seconds via a tick function. Then the resource object was given a random move speed and would traverse down the level at said speed. Next, any resource coming in contact with the player would simply be destroyed for now. And finally, a tile check was made to have the player move at half speed while in the quote-unquote water, aka the void. And, well, at least one of those things worked. The player's movement speed was now based on the tile that they currently occupied. However, as I would soon be reminded, I made the room for this level really big. So the spawn parameters were altered to instead measure from the center of the room instead of the edges. This solved the issue as now resources would actually show up for the player to collect. And so with that working, we could move on. A pause boolean was added next, and the resource movement was tied to that pause state. All of this in an attempt to mimic Void Train's ability to pause the base's movement at any time. Unfortunately, it seems defining this state in the create event for resource objects wasn't enough, and so said state was instead defined at the same time as its creation. This way all resources would now, for certain, be in sync with the actual pause state. So resources were then limited to certain distances before being destroyed, and then it was on to firing some projectiles. The projectile behavior was pretty typical: move in a specified direction until off screen, then destroy it for optimization's sake. A general shoot function was then created which would take speed and direction arguments and apply them to a newly created projectile. Next, the raft placement check was moved to the right click, so our left click can now become our shoot button. Again, nothing out of the ordinary here, with a basic cooldown determining the player's fire rate. And yep, something broke. At first I thought it might be an error with the arguments provided, but nope. I thought it could also maybe be an issue with the spawn code itself, but even hard coding everything using the resources instead still resulted in nothing showing up. And after spending a good 10 or so minutes rewriting everything over and over again, I realized the projectile movement code was the culprit. I'm still not entirely sure why the other things I tested also weren't working, but at the very least the projectiles were now spawning properly, so we could finally move on. Enemies were up next, and again were very typical in behavior. They would slowly move towards the player on spawn, which would also be controlled via the tick function. The enemy would also deal with knockback when coming in contact with the player's projectiles, which would require our good old reliable hurt system. And thankfully the enemy code would work just fine. These evil red blocks would menacingly stalk and constantly ease their way towards the player, who could do nothing but stun them with a bit of their green projectiles of hope. Yeah. So, with the basics now covered, it was time to go back and do a bit of refinement. A new function was added to check for surrounding tiles to a position given via arguments. If a tile exists in one of those 4 cardinal directions of the provided position, the function would then return true, else it would return false. This would then be applied to the raft placement code, so new placements had to be touching an existing raft piece. The checks ended up working beautifully as raft placement was now restricted and working just as intended. And so there was one last thing I wanted to add to wrap things up, and that was a super version of the enemy. This version would check its position on the grid, and if it comes in contact with a raft piece, much like super raft boats, well, that raft piece is straight up destroyed. That's right, the raft tile is removed, leaving the player to potentially be left without a base to stand on. It'll definitely require a bit of tweaking down the line, but for now it worked. And that would do it for this session. Again, a lot of familiar code and things we've done before, but as we've also seen today, no matter how many times you've done something and no matter how confident you may be with how it should go, there's always the possibility for an accident. So this was in fact a very good refresher to get me back into this type of game, and I'm hoping that most of the rust has worn off with this session. Anyway, with the basics done means that we'll be able to start tackling some of the new stuff, so next episode should be less familiar. But for now, that'll do it for this episode of Dev Diary. So if you enjoyed today's entry, consider leaving a like. Be sure to also subscribe and hit that bell if you haven't already, and let me know if you've ever dealt with any rust when coming back to coding something. Also, what type of theme do you think we should be going for this project? Space? An actual void? Should we stick with the water theme? Leave your thoughts and opinions in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.